Well, we have made it, the final week of October. It feels like just yesterday I was telling you about Psycho, and now here we are, the 5th week of my Halloween-themed series of recommendations. And I'm ending this month out with George Romero's Night of the Living Dead, a true classic in horror and independent filmmaking. The film begins in a cemetery in rural Pennsylvania as siblings Johnny and Barbara visit their father's grave. Barbara is attacked by a strange man and Johnny is killed. Barbara runs away from the man and hides in the nearby abandoned house. She discovers the occupants of the home to be dead, and as more people begin to surround the house, a man named Ben arrives. He boards up the windows and doors, securing them inside, and soon afterwards they discover 2 couples and a child who are hiding in the basement. After listening to the television, they learn that these people outside are actually all dead, who have been reanimated and are out to kill and eat the living. Will the survivors last the night? Watch Night of the Living Dead to find out. Today, Night of the Living Dead is one of those classic horror films that most horror fans are generally pretty familiar with, mainly as the film that invented zombies. And today, zombies are one of the most popular monsters in pop culture. They are featured in hundreds of movies, TV shows, video games, and comic books. However, it's also important to note that nowhere in Night of the Living Dead are they actually called zombies. The term zombie actually comes from Haitian folklore, and though it does involve the dead coming back to life, it's more associated with voodoo practices. In all the films like I Walked with a Zombie or White Zombie is actually referring to the Haitian definition of zombie and not what they're kind of known as nowadays. But once Night of the Living Dead came out, the zombie name stuck, and so Romero ended up calling them zombies in the later sequels. But Night of the Living Dead really established the kind of rules and what we would think of when we hear the word zombie. The slow walking, the eating flesh, and even to some extent the outstretched arms, although that really came later. And I will say, despite this film being over 50 years old, it's still pretty scary. Especially if you watch this film in a dark room with no distractions, I'd say this is probably the scariest movie I've recommended this month. Possibly with the exception of The Innocents.
Knows what, Miss Giddens, dear?
But regardless, with its perfectly spooky atmosphere and great black and white cinematography, I say this is a great one to watch on Halloween. I really like how seriously and realistically they try to approach this unrealistic situation. Romero systematically walks you through each step these characters have to take in order to protect themselves by boarding up the house, making makeshift torches to fight off the zombies with, and so on. This attention to detail was pretty remarkable considering how low of a budget this film was made on. And more significantly, this film was completely made and funded outside of Hollywood. And during the 60s, independent filmmaking was on the rise, with movies like Easy Rider, Medium Cool, Faces, and so on. But all these films were made by people who had experience in the industry. For a film to be made by a group of people outside of Hollywood with no Hollywood connections, and to be as good as it was, is truly remarkable. But this is not to say that George Romero and his collaborators were a bunch of amateur filmmakers.
A lot of people would say that a bunch of amateur filmmakers in Pittsburgh, but we weren't amateur filmmakers. We were filmmakers who did a low-budget film. We were making films before we did this, but they were commercials.
Several years earlier, they had formed a production company in Pittsburgh called the Layton Image, and they had become one of the leading commercial film companies in the area. Here they had learned to write, shoot, direct, and edit very efficiently. And then watching some of these commercials they made, you can really see how good they had gotten at conveying messages quickly and succinctly. They were able to experiment with their camera work and editing, and I think this not only helps speed up their process, but it makes the film still feel fresh 50 plus years later.
One of the fine things in that movie that people rarely discuss, to me, is the editing. How slickly edited it is. That's as much due to the attributable to the success of that movie as anything. And those fellows had been making commercials in Pittsburgh for several years, and some of the best editing in the world goes on.
Tell a story in 30 seconds or 60.
And so there was that cleanliness and very sharp editorial eye that went into it. The thing is, It is interesting because they internally in the film itself captured somehow an independent aura, and maybe even it has some aspects of amateurism to it. But if you really look at it technically, it's most professionally done.
So all of this commercial work that Romero and his friends were doing was all going towards the final goal of making a feature film. They eventually decided on making it a horror film as it was much easier to market and get funding for. And after several drafts, George Romero and his writing partner John Russo finally settled on what would become Night of the Living Dead. Romero saw it as somewhat inspired by the Richard Matheson story I Am Legend, where everyone has become a vampire and there is only one person left on Earth. Romero thought it would be interesting to take this concept, and in addition to changing up the vampires into his own kind of ghouls, he thought it would be interesting to set the story at the beginning of the outbreak as opposed to after it has already happened. The filming took place over 9 months. As though there were very few locations in the film, the crew had to keep taking breaks throughout the production in order to make commercials so that they could sustain themselves. And since having the film being shot in the small town of Evans City was still a pretty novel idea for many of the townspeople, the filmmakers got a lot of support from the local people, as well as the advertising community, the local police, and the news station. And a lot of the charm from this film actually comes from the fact that despite all the flaws and how rough the film can be at times, it has this great energy about it, as something that a lot of people came together and had a fun time making.
For all of the flaws and everything else that we know are in the movie and the low budgetness of it, there is still a human energy that is involved in this production that budget can't replace.
And so when making Night of the Living Dead, Romero took inspiration from a lot of other independent films, one being the 1962 film Carnival of Souls. And the director, Herc Harvey, had some similarities to George Romero, in that before he made his film, he worked for a production company that only made industrial films or educational films. And the ghouls in Carnival of Souls do have quite a resemblance to those in Night of the Living Dead. And stylistically, Romero said much of his approach for making Night of the Living Dead actually came from studying Orson Welles.
People say it's Hitchcockian, but I think it's more from Welles. Welles is Shakespeare films, Macbeth, Othello. The lighting, particularly. I was stealing from Orson Welles.
And when watching some of Welles' films, a lot of similarities can be seen, though the budget and the speed of the production kept Romero from covering his scenes in quite the elaborate ways that Orson Welles was known for doing. Much of the lighting, camera work, and editing does take from Welles. And this really worked out for them, as Orson Welles was not only a very accomplished and visionary filmmaker, but definitely by this point he was working in the low-budget independent field. And so many of the things Welles would do could actually be recreated relatively cheaply. For example, Welles would be known for having these beautiful shots that would often be draped in shadow, but he was not often able to build his own sets due to budget restrictions, and so he would often be left with whatever locations they could get. And so if a wall in a scene looked kind of flat or just needed more interesting shadows, many cinematographers would make use of a black cutout called a gobo. And these are placed in front of a light to create whatever kind of shadow you want. It's a very cheap trick that could give a scene a lot more atmosphere. And in watching Night of the Living Dead, you can see they made use of these gobos very frequently. So along with this being a great horror film, I really found Night of the Living Dead to be an important film for aspiring filmmakers.
There's something about that almost handmade, homemade kind of feel that was, I think, present in all of his movies. And there's something very inspiring about that to young filmmakers, to youngsters who want to be filmmakers, because it makes it feel accessible. It makes it feel possible.
Night of the Living Dead has been cited by many directors as being a very important and influential film. People such as Guillermo del Toro, Peter Jackson, Frank Darabont, Robert Rodriguez, Edgar Wright, and Jim Jarmusch. And I also noticed that the funding for the restoration was provided by the George Lucas Foundation, so it appears the creator of Star Wars is also a pretty big fan. Now, another aspect of Night of the Living Dead that's really hard to avoid talking about is just how much analysis has been put into this film, really retroactively. One of the main things that a lot of people notice first is that the main character in the film, Ben, is played by an African American actor named Dwayne Jones. And at the time in 1968, this would have been kind of a controversial choice to have an African American play the hero among a completely white cast. Usually at the time when this was done, it was because it was a main element of the story. But Night of the Living Dead does not make any mention of this. It's not a part of the story at all.
And that's when I think the statement is so strong, because there wasn't an attempt to make a statement, and thus so many people can read into it far more than was originally intended.
Romero said he wrote the character for one of his friends to play, who was white. But after Dwayne Jones auditioned, he saw he was a much better choice for the role. Romero and his fellow collaborators at the Latent Image were very open to casting people who normally would not have gotten roles in their commercials. So to them, casting Dwayne Jones was not really out of the ordinary. But it was this decision, along with just the timing of the film's release, really led the film to be analyzed for its social commentary. When the film came out in 1968, America was going through a lot. And that year, 1968, was actually considered one of the most turbulent years in the 20th century. I mean, we think 2020 is crazy, but in that year, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy were assassinated. There were riots, Vietnam was ramping up with the Tet Offensive and the My Lai Massacre, and the Civil Rights Movement was also ramping up. So despite Night of the Living Dead being made primarily in 1967, it was seen by many in the context in which it was shown, which was 1968. And much of this analysis really came in 1970, when it was discovered and promoted by several French film critics. And so this led a lot of people to look at it from a more analytical eye. Incidentally, much more so than even Romero and his friends had while making it. For instance, one of the first shots in this film is going through the graveyard, and you can see the American flag flapping very prominently in the frame. And so a lot of people took this as the filmmakers establishing that this film is really about the USA. And there are tons of other parallels and things that people have gotten out of this film, despite none of them being intentional by the filmmakers.
The one thing that this has certainly, that Night of the Living Dead and other projects have taught me, is that any time you do anything that can be held up for criticism, criticism or interpretation or whatever, people are free to attach whatever interpretation to a piece of your work they want to. In some cases, it's an interesting thought, and maybe we haven't even thought that deeply about it.
So that's Night of the Living Dead for you. If you'd like to watch this film, you are in luck, because it is available to watch for free pretty much everywhere since it's in the public domain. An error that was made when creating the film's title card in the opening scene meant that the film was released without a copyright, and so that's really one of the reasons this film spread so quickly. Now it's all over the internet and shows up pretty regularly on TV, especially in October. That being said, since it is in the public domain, the quality can vary quite drastically. I have seen some pretty good looking versions on YouTube in 720p. However, if you're a fan of this film and really want to learn from it, I can definitely recommend this Blu-ray release of it. And like many of these films I've talked about, it's from the Criterion Collection, and it's truly one of my favorite releases. I was kind of hesitant initially about getting this because it's a public domain film, so really you don't have to pay for it at all, you can watch it for free. I knew it was going to be restored well, but what really sealed the deal for me was really all the supplemental material that came with this. I mean, it's got multiple commentaries, interviews, video essays, one by the people behind Every Frame a Painting, if you've heard of them, quite a bit of unused footage from the film, and also an unreleased rough cut of the film. And I mean, sometimes bonus features aren't really that helpful, but I think this has really some of the best I've seen in quite a while. So there's really a lot to learn from watching the film and watching all the bonus features, and after watching it all, it felt almost like I'd completed this kind of small film course, almost, so it's pretty neat. And plus, as I said, the film's been restored very beautifully. It's got this 4K restoration that was done for its 50th anniversary, and it just looks great. But as I said, this set is not really for everyone. It's relatively expensive, especially if you just want to watch the movies. So if that's the case, I'd say your best bet is to look it up on YouTube. But if you really love the film and want to get kind of the full experience, I'd say this is your best way to go. And so for this week's comment question, I'm wondering, what's your favorite zombie film? You know, Romero started all with this film, but then he made about 5 sequel films, and then there's been a remake of this film, as well as some of those sequel films. And then there have been some other kind of zombie films, like World War Z and 28 Days Later. And of course, you can't forget some of those comedies either, like Zombieland or Shaun of the Dead, or The Dead Don't Die. So yeah, pick a favorite or just a couple favorites out of those. Or if you don't like zombie films, I get it, they're not really for everyone. So if that's not your cup of tea, you can talk about some of your favorite independent films. Because as I said, Night of the Living Dead is not only great as a zombie film or as a horror film, but it's also just a landmark in independent filmmaking. So if you have something like that or something else that really inspired you to go out and make a film, or just explore more of these kind of independent films, and you can list that in the comment section below too. But other than that, if you like this video, hit the like button below, and consider subscribing if you want to see more videos like this. So we have made it through October, and so you can look forward to films with a bit brighter tone next week. I know doing this 5 weeks of horror films was quite fun, but it's also a lot to do every single week. And so I'm going to go back to doing more of a mix next month of tone. It's not going to be all one kind of movie like it was this month. But I had a blast doing this horror film series, and I look forward to showcasing a new set of films starting next week. So remember to keep watching movies, and I'll see you next week.
They're coming to get you, Barbara.
Stop it! You're ignorant.
They're coming for you, Barbara.
Stop it! You're acting like a child.
They're coming for you. Look, there comes one of them now.